All right, well, why don't we get started? Welcome everybody to the Solving AuthN and AuthZ with Open Source Solutions webinar, brought to you today by Permit.io and SuperTokens. I'm Omkar Arasaratnam. I'll be the moderator for today's event. I am an open source advocate, AuthZ, AuthN enthusiast, and a permit investor as well. So if we can move over to the next slide, we'll take care of some housekeeping and logistics. So for everybody's knowledge, the webinar will be recorded. It'll be available on Permit's YouTube account. A link will be mailed to all of those that have registered. We will have an open Q&A at the end of the session. You can add your questions in the YouTube comments as well as on the Permit Slack channel under the general channel. There will be a thread started there, and we'll be keeping an eye on all of those comments, curating them and including them for the QA. Any future topics you'd like to hear about, join the community, bit.ly/permit-slack, and let us know what you'd like to hear in the future. And without further ado, we will get to intros. So as I mentioned, I'm Omkar Arasaratnam. In my day job, I'm a director of engineering at Google. And first, we will begin with my buddy, Or. Or, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Permit?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to have you with us. My name is Or Weiss. My background starts in the intelligence corps in the IDF in a unit called 8200, where I was an officer, developer, reverse engineer, yada, yada, yada. Continued to work in a couple of startups, including one that created containers before containers were a thing, but with a really bad go-to-market. Was a VP of R&D in a cybersecurity company, and created another DevTools company called Rookout. During my time at Rookout, I ended up rebuilding our access control 5 times in a company that wasn't even 3 years old. And I just thought that it was super stupid. So that's brought me together with my co-founder, Asaf, to create Permit.io, full stack permission solution. The idea is, instead of building permissions on your own, which is not unique to any product, you can just use Permit, connect it to your authentication solution, your product itself, and focus on actually building your product.
Thank you, Or. And there's no such thing as bad experience, right? In fact, that's some of the best experience that you learn through these frustrating situations. Next up, we have my buddy Advait, co-founder and CEO of SuperTokens. Advait, do you want to provide an intro?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you guys for having us, and thank you for organizing this. This is fantastic. I'm excited to go through this. And yeah, so I'm the co-founder of SuperTokens. We do open source user authentication. Similarly, I think this is born out of personal frustration and actually seeing like hundreds of other people struggle with different aspects of authentication. So we went through Y Combinator. We had the privilege of seeing hundreds of startups, sort of go through this process and really understand all the pain points. And so yeah, that's sort of, we want to build an authentication experience that's native to you, to your app, to your product, and kind of just solve like, the traditional build versus buy trade-offs. So you get the best of both worlds.
Excellent. Well, we have a lot of stuff to double click into. From my own background, I began my career at IBM. I spent a long time on Wall Street, and of course now I'm at Google, so I've seen a significant share of authentication and authorization problems across corporate America, and I've got a stock full of questions for you guys. So I'm going to keep you on your toes for the next hour. Is that all right?
Awesome.
Excellent. All right, so why don't we get into some of the basics, folks? For those that aren't familiar with identity and access management, why don't we cover, what's authentication, what's authorization? And to break it up, Or why don't you cover what's authentication? And then Advait, if you could follow up with what's authorization.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, you turn it around. That's nice.
Yeah.
So authentication is really about verifying identities, is knowing that the person connecting to your system is who they claim they are. And in addition to that, having the background, the additional information on where they're coming from and what's related to their identity. That's often referred to as claims, especially if you're talking about the standard today that most solutions work with, which is JSON Web Tokens. JSON Web Tokens are cryptographically signed documents that contain both your identity and claims about it. For example, which department you belong to, which country you're residing in, and other elements that might be unique to your organization or to the application you're connecting to. Authentication usually drives a lot of its parameters or its attributes out of identity management, which is another solution up the stack that resides on the organization side and just manages those identities. Authentication often connects to identity management through loved protocols like SAML and OpenID Connect, which can be annoying, but often simplified by good vendors like our folks, SuperTokens here.
Excellent. Yeah. And I told you I'm going to keep you guys on your toes. That's why I switched it up. All right. So Abhay, why don't we cover your take on authorization?
Yeah, so I think tying in from what Or said, right? The claims, everything that happens from the claims point beyond, right? So authentication is knowing who is the user, and then authorization is knowing what do they have access to, right? So like we use this analogy, like you're walking into the building, right? And then the security guard confirms that, you know, you are who you say you are. And then authorization is, do you have access to the right rooms? Can you open those cabinets? Can you access those computers or whatever that you should be allowed to do, right? You can't access unless you're like the owner of the building, you can't go to every floor, right? So, so the way you determine that for your app, how you determine which users have access to what things, is essentially authorization.
Got it. We're going to go back to Or. I'm going to ask you a question about authorization.
All right.
In my experience, working at pretty large organizations, hundreds of thousands of people, one of the things that starts off as a fairly simple paradigm that quickly becomes the undoing of the identity and access management organization is the choice to use role-based access control. Role-based access control seems really simple, but from what I've seen, every organization I've been in, there's like 10 times as many roles as there are people. And if you take an example of like IBM with 400,000 people, or JP Morgan Chase with 350,000 people, those are millions of roles. I've heard about something called attribute-based access control, and that's gained popularity in some small niches, but really, I guess, hasn't simplified things to a level that it's been widely adopted. As somebody who lives and breathes authorization, I'd love to get your thoughts on the advantages of each, some of the pitfalls maybe. What have you seen?
Yeah, that's a terrific subject and a very wide one. I'll try to do it justice. So first of all, I think we need to recognize that building identity management, building permissions is a journey, an evolutionary journey. No one knows where you're going to end up. You're building something and you don't want to build everything from day one because you don't actually know what you're going to need. So the secret sauce is being able to adapt and adjust and gradually evolve with the changes and requirements of your organization and the products you're building with it or for it. I think before we talk about RBAC, we should talk about where people usually start. Where a developer builds an application, they usually start with the perfect model known as admin, not admin. I'm the developer, I'm the admin, everyone else is not, and I'm the only one that can change permissions and this thing. And initially that also seems fun because it works, right? The users can do what they do, I can manage the application, but then it quickly evolves to admin, not admin, and super admin, because now other people need permissions. And then it usually evolves to access control lists. Like here are specific lists of people that can do specific things. And then it usually evolves into RBAC. Each step that we take in that journey is usually triggered by a specific requirement coming either from the customers themselves saying, hey, I need better tools to control this product or offering you deliver to me. It can come from security and compliance saying, we need checks and balances on this thing. It impacts critical business elements. We can't just allow whatever people want to happen here. And it can come also from actual product or R&D requirements. For example, moving from a monolith to microservices or needing to implement multi-tenancy. And sometimes it's also things that you don't think about. For example, in my previous company, Rookout, as I mentioned before, I ended up rebuilding our access control multiple times. And one of those times was when one of our business partners, Cisco, that was onboarding people to the system, came in and said, we want our own back office. We want to manage the permissions separately than the way you manage them. And I was like, damn, I didn't think of that scenario. So the point here is that you can't imagine at day one all the things that you're gonna need. So the secret sauce is building the groundwork so you can gradually add more things and evolve. So I don't think you should aim for RBAC or ABAC from day one, but you should know that they're out there and you might need to grow into them as more requirements come in. As for RBAC, it's probably the most popular one because it's ordered, but still not too complicated. ABAC essentially often builds on top of RBAC and adds more specific conditions, scenarios. So for example, a policy like only an admin can do something is pure RBAC, but a policy like only users located in the continental US during the afternoon is allowed to do that. Those are specific attributes or conditions that you can tap with ABAC. And in the end of the day, every case is a snowflake and you'll encounter different attributes and conditions as you go along. So the bottom line is they're both great. They have pros and cons, and you just need to grow to them gradually as you tackle your challenges.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the areas that we found was especially difficult to express within RBAC and often led to creating another role was inverse or exclusive sets, where you want a condition, but you want the exclusionary set of the condition to be true, whereas RBAC tends to be inclusionary. Okay, Advait, moving on, my friend. We've talked about authentication. We've deep dived into a bit of authorization. How did the two connect? And maybe we can spend a little time on what's a JWT and how you put claims in a JWT.
Yeah, I mean, you connect through the user ID. Right? So the authentication layer creates the user ID in the database, and then you have this user ID that you then pass onto the authorization system, right? And then the authorization then reads the user ID and then knows what the roles are for that user or for that user ID, and then enforces those policies. A JWT stands for a JSON Web Token. And I think, as Or alluded to earlier, it's effectively like an encrypted file, like something that's signed by like a public-private key pair. And the format of that information is in a JSON, and hence it's called a JSON Web Token.
Got it. So look, we've talked about a couple of terms here: OAuth, JWT, cookies, sessions. Do you want to walk me through what each of those are, and maybe our audience, just to get a little more color as to how each of those play a role in the identity and access management waterfall?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of like confusion, or like we hear like a lot of like sort of like trivial misconceptions between all these different concepts. So it's like it's pretty important that we get this right. So OAuth is a protocol that governs how your app communicates with a third-party app that stores the user's information. Like the best example is, let's take an example of Google, right? So let's say the user has an account in Google. They're now coming to your app and they want to do sign in with Google on your app. Now your app needs to be able to access this user's information on Google, right? Without actually having the user's credentials, right? Without having the user's username and password for Google, right? So the way the protocol that allows your app to talk to Google to get that information from Google is essentially governed by the OAuth protocol. So it's a protocol. JWTs, as we defined, it's essentially like this information that's signed by a public-private key pair, and it's a way of like transferring information back and forth. Cookies is like this storage mechanism on a browser that's like associated with a particular domain. So you can store the JWT in a cookie, right? So that's the file, and then the method of storage is the cookie. And then sessions is like the way you communicate between your own front end and back end. Your front end is fundamentally an untrusted client, like an untrusted entity, because anyone can have access to that front end. And then you need a way to communicate between the front end and back end, so the back end knows that the front end is secure, or that the front end is who it says it is, right? And then the way you do that is through sessions.
Got it. Thank you, Abhit. That's an excellent answer. Thanks for deep diving on that. We're going to switch back to my buddy Or. Or, you've built a lot of stuff, a lot of identity and access management systems, and in fact, Permit focuses on the authorization layer. How should our audience members think about that buy versus build decision? I've worked in organizations where it was all buy, and we would staff only engineers to kind of glue things together. I've worked in other organizations where everything from the source code repository to the compiler is built in-house. How should people think about the trade-offs of building versus buying their identity and access management solutions?
Terrific question. And in the end of the day, per case, I think a tough one, because you don't want to, kind of like we talked before, you don't want to build everything to its utmost from day one, and you don't want to spend too much money or resources integrating too many complex things. So it's really about finding the right balance. But thinking of that balance, I think we need to take two things into account. One, things are moving. Like if you go, I don't know, 15, 20 years back, most of the software you'd be writing would be proprietary. It'd have some open source components, but mostly proprietary things you'd write on your own. Nowadays, the percentage of open source is significantly surpassed the proprietary parts. And more so, third-party services are becoming a critical part of almost any application. So the standards or the baseline that you want to start building from is constantly shifting. Because we need to build more complex stuff, the ground level that we want to start with is constantly rising. And at each point in time, when we're starting a new project, we need to understand what's the ground level at this point. So I think if we go like 10 years back, building authentication, for example, on your own, still kind of made sense. It was like people were saying, oh, this is a critical component. How can I trust someone else to do it? But as the water level kind of rose, and also people realized this is really hard to get right. There's specific specialized skills, understanding cryptography, understanding real-time system and event-driven systems, understanding OAuth and how you connect all of these protocols, understanding SAML. All of these components kind of jumped on the wagon, and people started to realize that they have no unique offering in trying to implement this on their own, and there is actually a significant disadvantage. And I think at this point, we're also getting to where authorization is going through the same kind of revolution. In the end of the day, when you look at authorization, we're talking about experiences that most people have seen like a billion times, like user management with the ability to assign roles, API key management, invites, approval flows, audit logs. Those are not unique to any application. And also, you can make a lot of mistakes, critical mistakes that can translate, just like with authentication, into vulnerabilities if you get them wrong. So the first line is, in general, the baseline of where you want to start is constantly moving. And probably with IAM solutions, not sticking to that baseline can come with a lot of disadvantages and significant security risks. On top of that, it doesn't mean that you need to adopt all of the solutions out of day one. You can start with adopting their open source version. You can start with adopting them on just specific microservices on specific components, and you can gradually add more capabilities and improve. The most important thing, I believe, is understanding what is important for you as a developer, as a company at this point in time, achieving that, and for everything else, just setting up the groundwork that when you need those additional features, you'll be able to add them with ease without having to go back to square one. So, and to understand that groundwork is understanding where the baseline is and understanding how your journey is likely to continue.
Or you have pulled on a thread that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to ask both of you the same question. And I'm going to preface this as I'm a big open source guy. One of my first roles was as a developer for Gentoo Linux PowerPC 64 platform. I've also contributed code to the Linux kernel before. So like this, my heart warms when I hear this. So first to Or, then to Advait, why open source?
So first of all, I'd start with the vendor side before we talk about like the adopter side or the using developer side. From the vendor side, I think it's critical to create open source and build with open source so you can chime in on the global conversation and create standards. Open source is the de facto way today where different companies around the world and different developers around the world come together and decide what's the standard things and how things can connect together. And without that baseline, essentially it's really hard to spark these conversations. So not having open source essentially means you're building things in disconnect from the rest of the planet, which when you state it that way is just pure silliness. On top of that, open source gives you good alignment if you do it right. If you do it right, it gives you good alignment with your customers. It gives your customers the comfort that they have something they can fall back to. It gives them the comfort that they can start gradually. As I said before, they don't have to buy the entire thing. They can test it, they can try it, and they can find what's their sweet spot for them at each moment in time. So it really, I think, creates an alignment between the vendor and the rest of the world as a whole, and the vendor and their customers. And that's really what we try to do with our open source. We want to have it as clear as possible that this is a fallback that you can use, and also have the alignment clear, that knowing that you can always have this and it's not going to affect how we think about our business. So that's on the vendor side. On the customer side, I think it really gives you the ability to know that you're using something that you can build gradually with, which I kind of mentioned on, and something that can interconnect or be interchanged with other elements in your modular software. And in the end of the day, building software is playing Legos. And if you have components that you can't connect together, that usually translates to having either a hard time or wasting a lot of time making them connect. So that's why I really think open source is the way to go.
How about you? I know open source is a passionate topic for you as well. Would love to get your thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I think open source for us is like critically important, right? Like as of today, like every single thing we've ever built is 100% open source. So like, we're like completely open source in the true spirit of it. So for us, I think it's like, honestly, like you can boil it all down to essentially, we believe this is the best way of solving problems, right? So the reasons we've picked open source is because open source solves a lot of the problems you typically see. So both on the customer side plus on the vendor side. So starting with the customer, right? Like being open source means you're reducing vendor lock-in, right? You're reducing the need for the customer to trust you. You're increasing that trust because everything is, you can audit it, but then you're also decreasing the need for them to actually trust you because they can run it themselves. If you get acquired, they can still, they can migrate out. There's just like a lot more control they get fundamentally with open source. They can host it with you. See, with a SaaS provider, they can only host the solution with you. With open source means they can host it themselves. And that means that if the vendor decides to arbitrarily change pricing, you can just be like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to host it myself. I don't need you to go host it for me, right? So you're decreasing the amount of trust that they need to like pick a solution, especially for something as core as infrastructure, right? Infrastructure, like it's so core to your app that like if an auth provider decides to do something, it can cripple your company. So vendor lock-in is like a big reason. It's like auditable, it's easy to adopt, self-hostable, all of that kind of stuff. And then even on the vendor side, right? I think you're connected to your users. It's the speed of iteration, the level of feedback you get from your customers is just a lot quicker, right? Because people are commenting on GitHub issues, people are letting you know the community grows better, all of those kind of things. And then I think obviously, and then on the more business side of it, you also get contributors. People actually contribute and improve your product. We've seen that a lot already, right? Where early in our journey, but we're already seeing we've crossed like 150, like 120 or 150 contributors now, which is meaningful. Like, that like so many people have contributed to our code base, and some of those contributions have been incredibly meaningful. Things that would have taken us like another year to get to. So yeah, we see like, and overall, we just like all the values and philosophies of open source just like really resonate with us as individuals. It's how we like think of life. It's how we think about building a company. So at the end of the day, it's just like the values make like a lot of sense to us.
Mm-hmm. I think also with those contributions, I think another added value that I think is also specifically critical for the IAM space is security. Like security by obscurity is something that doesn't work. And if you build something in the open, if other people can review the code and find the vulnerabilities, find the issues with it, overall, you get better security for everyone, especially using those specific solutions. So yeah, security is another item on the list.
Yeah, what was the old adage with thousands of eyes, all bugs are shallow? So fully support that.
Yes.
Okay, maybe going back to Advait. Advait, we've talked a lot about, the general stuff about authentication, authorization, one of my favorite topics, open source. Could you spend a few minutes talking about how SuperTokens works?
Yeah, sure. So we actually fit, like, the way SuperTokens integrates very natively with your app. So we provide you a front-end SDK that sits on your front end. We provide you a back-end SDK that goes in your API layer. So if your APIs are written in Node, Golang, Python, we have specific SDKs for each of those. And then we have like the core, which essentially persists data to the database. And the way SuperTokens works is the UI. So a lot of other authentication providers also have a pre-built UI, but our pre-built UI sits on your front end, right? So it's native. So instead of it being a redirect or an iframe or anything like that, it's completely like controllable by you. And similarly, all the auth logic resides on your API layer. So yeah, just basically it's like a native integration into your app, and then it comes out of the box. So it gives you like very quick implementation times, but gives you complete control over the way the product works. We expose all the underlying primitives to you. So you want to switch out, use your own email or SMS sending provider for passwordless. You want to, change the way, like, override any of our APIs to change any of the logic. You can do all of that fairly easily within your API layer.
Awesome. And now, or if you can spend a few minutes maybe talking a little bit about how permit.io works, the next leg in this waterfall.
Yeah, of course. So Permit at its core leverages two open source projects, OPA, which we've adopted, Open Policy Agent, and OPAL, our own open source project, Open Policy Administration Layer, to enable your application to bake in permissions quickly. We provide you a ready-made microservice for authorization. It's essentially OPA, OPAL, and an API service, a ready-made sidecar that you can mix into your app, and you can query for your policy, and an SDK that you can embed in different points in your code to create enforcement points, essentially checks if this flow of code is allowed to happen. That SDK accepts the main function there, permit check, accepts three variables: your identity, which you can get directly from your authentication provider. It can be the JSON Web Token or the ID out of it directly as is. So you can literally call SuperTokens, get the JSON Web Token, just pass it to us as literally as a variable. And the rest two are the resource and action you're acting on. So essentially, is this identity allowed to perform this action on this resource? That is then managed through that microservice for authorization through policy as code. The permit UI allows you to, with a low-code, no-code interface, generate multiple policies according to your need, RBAC policies very soon, like 2 weeks from now, ABAC policies that are maintained as code in the Git repository of your choice. You can also add code on your own. And are delivered in real time through the OPAL architecture. In the end of the day, the result is that you can change your policy, your roles, your behaviors, or your conditions on the fly at any moment in time, enabling different stakeholders to take effect, to chime in on the conversation. And it's real time, it updates in your application while being audited and controlled through your source control of choice and through audit logs that you can manage in systems of your choice.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for explaining that. I think what'll really tie this together is if we get our friend Philip to set up the demo and walk through that. Just as a reminder, as we're transitioning over to the demo, if you have any questions on any of the stuff that we've talked about so far, or on any of the stuff that you'll see in the demo, please either put it in the YouTube comments in the live stream, or if you can go to the permit Slack in the general channel, there's a thread where people are asking questions, and we'll be able to pick those up after the demo. Now, Philip, over to you for the demo.
Thank you. So it'll be my absolute pleasure to share this. Oh, actually, sharing is disabled. Can we just make sure that I can share my screen? And while we wait here, is it working? There we go. Perfect. Perfect. Okay.
It's a good time to also mention that Philip is a dev advocate at Permit. and he's prepared a demo for us of connecting super tokens and permit together.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. So once that I verified that we can see it. Okay, perfect. So before I actually start the demo, I'd just like to say a few things that I will cover in this. And basically, it will go over how simple it is to set up SuperTokens as your authentication service. And then we're going to look at how simple and easy it is to change your permissions within permit as your authorization side. And essentially, then we're going to look at the handoff point between SuperTokens and permit to really kind of pull all this together and just demonstrate how simple this kind of integration is that provides so many benefits to the application that you might be running. So as I start the demo, I think it's important to mention that once we get this screen, there's within any kind of application, there's paths that we cannot access. We have to keep secure. And something that SuperTokens does that's very easy to demonstrate, and they provide it out of the box, is that if we kind of try and direct to a page that's restricted and is protected, we are not allowed to do that. Now, let me actually move on to showing you the demo and kind of jumping into registering with an account. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sign up with GitHub. Now, I have already done this previously, and essentially what it allows me to do is it registers my account as an administrator. So this is the account that has the role of an administrator. So as I log in, we'll just wait a second, and what will be in front of us is a screen. It's a basic screen that just a simple UI that demonstrates that we have a user and we can learn more about that user. Now, I think from here it will be a good point for me to actually jump into permit and show you that within permit, what we can see is that we have this role that I already previously created, which is my email with the role of administrator. And I think if we jump into the policy editor, we'll actually get an overview of the different roles that we have within permit. We have the administrator role, which we can perform certain actions on, such as view personal information or view the GPG key. We have another role called friend, which can only view the personal information. And then we have a role, which is the stranger, which essentially doesn't have access to anything apart from just viewing this front page. Now, because I am an administrator, I'm able to learn more about myself, and I can also copy my private GPG key, which I think is important to mention, that this is all coming from the backend. So essentially, there is two permissions check within this application. The first one is on the front end, which actually allows us to see this and perform this action. And the other one is a permission check on the backend to actually give this GPG key to us. Now, we're going to dive a little bit later into the code just to show you where all of this happens. But I think now it's a good example to show you how quick permit actually adjusts those permissions that actually stop us performing certain tasks. So actually, if I just disable this GPG key here on the administrator role, which I am logged in as, if I click on learn more, I'll be able to see that information, but that GPG key is now hidden from me. In the same way, if I just completely disable all my permissions, if I try to learn more, unfortunately, that fails and it just doesn't work. So you can see how very quickly permit allows you to kind of integrate those specific permissions that the specific role and the user has to perform in your application. Now, if I just log out of this account, and now we can focus on signing up with specific emails or maybe roles that might be already embedded into our system. So for example, I can jump in as a role, for example, with SuperTokens. And I think one thing to mention here is that for the demo purposes, obviously, we have some rules defined that allow us to create an account as SuperTokens and assign a specific permission for SuperTokens. But of course, this kind of verification will have to be also checked, as a in the backend to make sure that this domain is actually registered and exists and it actually belongs to this person. But for the demo purposes, we have some very basic rules just to make sure to show that. Now, if I just log in with a user here and we sign up, because I signed up with a SuperTokens email, it should appear here. There we go. Oh, sorry, I just refreshed the page. It just appeared here. And we can see that because it was signed up with SuperTokens, or if it was, for example, permit.io, we get the role of a friend, meaning that if we try and look at this profile here, we can see it, but we can't see the GPG key. because in our policy editor under the friend role, we don't have this permission enabled. Now, similarly, with signing up with a different email, for example, an email that is just doesn't reference anything. If I just sign up here, when we look at our policy editor, we'll be able to see that that user has been created. The role is a stranger because there was no recognition of a certain company that we set beforehand or any other rules. And essentially, if I try and learn more about myself in this case, well, I cannot do that because that role of this specific account is a stranger. Now, I think it's a nice kind of tangent to jump off this UI demonstration and actually look at the code to show you the very important, and I would say most important, handoff point that happens between SuperTokens and permit, where all of that information kind of gets transferred. So if we jump in here, and I hope I'll try and make it a little bit bigger, like so. So for example, within SuperTokens, we are given and required for this Next.js app that I'm running here to create this backend config. And as one of the rules to create this handoff point, we are overriding specific API calls, which are the third-party authentication sign in and sign up, and the email password sign up, to take over that information, consume what SuperTokens has collected from the user, and at that same instance, register a user to permit, meaning that we have whatever user is in SuperTokens is also synced at the same time within permit. Now, this register user in permit function is defined right here. And essentially, it says that any user that registers gets automatically assigned the role of stranger. Yes,
Philip, I'm not sure we're seeing the code on the screen, so maybe just double verify you're sharing the right parts.
Yes, just 1 second. Can you let me know if you can see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay. So
maybe take a step back too.
Yeah, let me take a step back and
no worries.
Try and reintroduce this. So as I was saying before, there is this backend configuration that we have. And actually, maybe it might be worth going this again, because it is a little bit complicated for people that might be new to this at first. But essentially, as part of the SuperTokens requirement within a Next.js app that we're currently running here, we are required to create this backend configuration file where we essentially define the way our backend is going to handle our users. Now, within this third-party email and password node that we're initializing here, we're technically supposed to override certain functionality for the third-party sign up and the email and password sign up to essentially capture the user that gets created within SuperTokens and sync that user to permit. And this is that handoff point that's very important to highlight, where before we even see the user interface, before we actually get logged in and finally the page appears that is protected for anyone that is unauthenticated. So within these two functions here, we have a register user in permit. And essentially within this register user in permit, for anyone that creates an account or creates and tries to authenticate with a role that doesn't belong to a certain company, in this case, either SuperTokens or permit.io, they are a stranger. But in this case, we have a very simple rule that says if the email does contain this specific domain, well, they are automatically becoming friends. And essentially, within permit, we're running the sync user function that syncs that user to permit. So we have that same information both on SuperTokens and permit. So then we can kind of assign those specific roles and the permissions for that role. Now I want to jump onto what actually is happening within permit when we are performing a check. And once, let me just find a piece of code here that has the check, and it's called check permissions. And essentially within permit, whenever we are checking for a user, if they have a permission to perform a certain action, we are required to pass a generic user ID, an action, which we are performing, and a resource. And in this case, the resource that we are performing this action on is the card that you saw in the UI. Now here we have a simple call to the permit API. And if I just jump into here, we're verifying here the session within SuperTokens, making sure that we are always part of that session, so then we can perform those permit checks. So at this point, we know that the user from the SuperToken side has been verified and exists, and there's a current session running. And then we can perform that permit check where we're checking and passing in that user ID, passing in the action, passing in the resource, and essentially then giving us an answer whether we can or we cannot perform the specific task or action that we want to. Now, I think also within here, it's important to highlight and to showcase how the checks for permissions work. So as you saw previously, we have this check permission function called where we pass in if we can view the personal information on the resource, which is card. And then later on, we're checking if we can view the GPG key on the card. And this is just covering the front end visibility of that key. But then also further on, we have another function called the fetch GPG key, just for security reasons, where we're calling to get that GPG key from the backend. And within the backend, which I just transferred to here, we're verifying and fetching the GPG key, where again, we are verifying that session from SuperTokens, and we are performing a permit check again to make sure that that GPG key can get sent back to the front end. So I think as per diving into the code, I think I'm going to stop here. I don't want to complicate it too much. If any of you guys that are watching this webinar are interested in playing around with this code, checking out for yourself, seeing how it works, you'll be able to find it in a follow-up email. We'll make sure to produce this repository for you with clear instructions how to run it, so you can play around with it and you can experience how beautifully SuperTokens integrates with permit and how simple it can be to actually solve a problem that exists right now, which is very complicated, like it was mentioned in this webinar, where our authentication and authorization can be solved in a very simple way. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand it off back, and we can maybe ask some questions if that's the next step.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Philip. And thank you for your passion for the subject. Certainly rings true.
Absolutely.
So if we can go to the next slide, there we go, questions. So of course, as mentioned before, please post your questions to the YouTube channel, also in the permit Slack, and we'll cover them live here. I've got a set of questions that we've been curating, and I'm going to dive into some of them. The first one is coming straight for your subject that's very near and dear to your heart. How do you pick the most suitable authentication system? What criteria should somebody consider when picking an authentication system?
Yeah, I mean, so it obviously depends on your use case, right? Short answer is it depends, but essentially, like it depends on what you're building, right? Are you building a side project? Are you just building something to hack together that's going to be used by you and like 10 friends, or is this going to be like are you building a startup today, or is this like are you at a large enterprise and you're building something for that enterprise, right? So those are three very different thought processes that you have there. And then once you understand that, I think, so if you're building at the enterprise, it's like typically you definitely need to buy or use an existing solution versus like trying to build something from scratch, because your use case is going to be far more complicated. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, I don't generally say you can build stuff yourself, but if you are building something super simple, like you literally just want like the most basic set of features, and you just want to learn something, maybe you can go build some authentication yourself. And now in this like in between, right, or like startups or growth companies, and you need to now use an existing solution, and you don't know what solution to use. What you need to start thinking about is how important is the data sovereignty, right? Like, do you need to control and own the data? Do you need, like, are you okay with it being hosted on a third-party service? How important is like vendor lock-in? How core to your infrastructure is authentication? All of those kind of things. That's one criteria. Another criteria is, what are the authentication methods do you need, right? Do you need passwordless? Do you need email, password, social login? Do you need SSO, like SAML? There's like just like a ton of things there. So what are your feature requirements? And then based on those, you sort of like, so there's like a feature set. There's like you need open source. You need it to be self-hosted. You need to control and manage the user data. So those are some of the like primary considerations when you're thinking through authentication.
Got it. As you were talking about this, we had a question come through the live QA that I think somewhat related. Somebody asks, I believe it's Tad. One thing I'd like in an OIDC / JWT AuthN token is the strength of the authentication to be reflected. Imagine something that says, whoops, somebody's been authenticated with multi-factor authentication, something of that nature. What are your thoughts on that, Advait?
Yeah, exactly. So that's key, right? Like that's pretty important because there are multiple places where you need a claim like that to be within the JWT itself. So MFA is one good example, but has the user verified their email IDs? What is their role? So these are all various claims. And yeah, so we're making this easier, but like we're constantly enabling you as a developer to add those claims within the JWT. So the JWT contains certain default things, right? Like who created the JWT, who is the audience for the JWT, what is the expiry, what is the user ID. Those are things that come default within the JWT. But then you as the developer can then add things like is MFA done? Was it done within a certain period of time? Is the email verified? And all of these other claims can then be added manually to the JWT as well.
Got it. Or I think this one's for you. What's the difference between permit.io and OPAL? You'd mentioned some of this earlier, but could you provide us a few more details on the differences?
Yeah, that's a good question. So while OPAL is an open source project that enables you the infrastructure to build your authorization service, it's not a full authorization service. It's essentially a pipeline to keep your authorization up to date in real time and to manage it in scale, to administer it in scale. Permit uses is essentially built on top of OPAL and OPA and some other cool engines, but it adds the interfaces on top, and that's I think the main differentiation point. So that user management interface we saw, that the ability to do invites, the ability to generate policy on the fly, those are things that Permit adds on top of OPAL and are not part of OPAL.
Got it. I think we're going to go back to Advait for the next question. There's been a lot of stuff in the news about passwordless authentication and getting rid of passwords and things of that nature. What are your thoughts? And is that something that we can solve with open source, or do we have to rely on third parties and service providers for this?
Yeah. So yeah, I think obviously, like, I think we all sort of understand the pain points with passwords. Nobody likes managing a unique password per account. There's like a lot of like gas of vulnerabilities. People reuse their passwords. People use passwords that can be brute forced. So there's multiple, sort of security vulnerabilities around passwords. And in an ideal world, we live in a world without passwords. So I think we're getting so until now, passwordless was like, or well, maybe not until now, but for a lot of people, passwordless meant magic links and SMS OTPs, right? And I think that's very limiting of what passwordless really is and can be. So in that definition of passwordless, I think maybe it's not at the point where it can replace passwords. But I think like the next iteration of passwordless, which is like biometric based authentication, you're now getting to the point where all your devices come default with biometrics, right? Like your iPhone, your phone, you're always using your Face ID. With your laptop, you have fingerprint and all of these kind of things, right? So like biometric authentication is being built into your device, which now gets you to the point where you can use that as the method of authentication. And that's far more secure and a much better way of logging into your apps, because there is only one face, right? And that can't be stolen. So I think that iteration of passwordless is really interesting. And whether can it be solved by open source? Yes, fundamentally yes, right? You can have that same source code in open source or in SaaS. The reliance on third parties will become, in the case of magic links or SMS, how do you actually send the email, or how do you actually send the SMS? Do you want to that's where the reliance of the third party comes in. And in the case of like biometrics, you have to rely on the OEM, the person that makes the device. You have to tie into that OS to then actually be able to authenticate the face, right? So there will always be some reliance, but that's just software. So that'll always be the case.
Yeah, and thinking about this, if we can add a comment, maybe stepping out of my role as host for a second, I think the other interesting thing to think about is with a lot of the, what you referred to as like the first generation multi-factor authentications, be it a link or a SMS, attackers are getting more and more sophisticated, and there's more and more ways to spoof these things, and there's more and more ways to phish people into providing their credentials. I'm also a big fan of stronger forms of authentication, be it proximity based through Bluetooth, or using something like a cryptographic key like a FIDO key that's pinned so it can't be phished. I think all of these are really interesting items, which on the surface they feel a bit cumbersome, but I think some of the work that Microsoft, Google, and Apple have done in terms of lowering the barrier of entry certainly is going to cause a lot of these to be adopted more broadly. We have a spicy one for OR. What about Cerbos, which I understand may be a competitor?
Yeah, they're a competitor, cool company based out of the UK. Actually, the founder of Cerbos and I are both investors in another company, which is kind of funny. I think they're building cool stuff. I like their open source approach. I dislike the fact that they chose to build yet another engine. I feel there are plenty of policy engines out there, ones that are already gaining popularity. And I also am not a fan of YAML. Like, I feel that there's enough YAML out there. So the choice of using YAML as a configuration language personally is not something that I jive with. But I think it's a cool engine, and I think their overall philosophy, especially around latency, makes a lot of sense. And what I think is unique about Permit is that we're not trying to build another engine. We're not saying this is the best engine and you should stick to that. And with OPAL, we're trying to connect multiple engines. So we've started with OPA. I don't want to put in too many spoilers, but we're planning to support additional engines out of the box, because we know different people need different tools, different languages. And I think supporting Cerbos, if it gains popularity, would also make sense. So yeah, they're a cool product.
Thanks so much for that, for answering that question, and thanks, Yaron, for asking it. Moving back to Advait, how reliable is using an open source solution for something as sensitive as authentication? Who's accountable if something should go south?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I mean, so in the sense that, so I think in general, right, obviously we think that I think we alluded to this earlier, which is because it's open source, typically you've had more eyeballs go through the code, right? You've had more people look at it, you've had more people audit it, you've had more people implement it and things like that, right? So to that sense, whereas with the SaaS, you don't know if one person's using it or 1,000 people, at least at the earliest stages, right? Like if you're picking a newer tool, you just don't know how many people are using it. You don't know if it's battle tested and all of those kind of things. Whereas open source, again, the trust factor is reduced. But yeah, having said that, I think, again, you do have this issue where if you are using the self-hosted version, if you aren't relying on the company, if you're not paying the company, then there is an element of responsibility that you are taking on when you choose to host it yourself. Obviously, at the end of the day, like the creators of the project do have their reputation at stake. They do have the brand at stake, so you still have that same level of detail and attention to detail that's required. But yeah, you are, by self-hosting it, you are definitely taking on some responsibility yourself, because it's harder to point the finger at someone because you're just using something free and open source.
Yeah, I think the other thing people should really think about as they go on this journey is, I know it's been in the news a lot, and I hate to engage in a buzzword, but the supply chain associated with it, right? And to what Or said a little while ago, a lot of software these days have become gluing bricks together, and being able to have a strong or a very detailed view as to which components make up the supply chain for the software you're using, which you tend to have insight into when using open source. Yeah. It allows you to much more easily control that surface area as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we've seen multiple pretty significant vulnerabilities in the supply chain in the last year, right? So yeah, I think having having transparency around the dependencies is another bonus.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to go back to OR for, I think, what'll be our last, maybe second last question, depending on how much time we spend on it. How does OPAL handle sensitive information? Is it compatible with compliance standards like GDPR and HIPAA, PCI, stuff like this?
Terrific question. And I think it also kind of connects to when you compare Permit or OPAL to other solutions like we touched on before. So one unique aspect of Permit is like the interfaces, not just the infrastructure, not just the APIs. That's something that is unique to Permit. And the other part that is unique to Permit is OPAL, and really the way that its architecture is built. It's really designed to be event-driven and to separate the data plane from the control plane, which can be a critical aspect, especially if you're using OPAL as part of Permit as a SaaS solution. By separating the data plane and the control plane, you can have the OPAL servers or Permit manage all these complexities for you and add interfaces on top and have visibility onto what's happening in general, but you don't have to expose all the data into them. So in general, it enables you to work with a need-to-know basis. On each microservice that is managing authorization for you needs to know only the policy and only the data that is relevant for them. And that's enabled by that separation that essentially works by the OPAL server. Instead of it sending the data itself to the OPAL clients to be loaded into the policy engine, it sends instructions on where to fetch the data. So if you're thinking about using Permit, for example, Permit manages all of it for you. It sends instructions to the PDPs, the OPAL and OPA combinations that you deploy on your side. They are deployed within your VPC, and they can go directly to your database or to a third-party service you're working with and get the data that they need to make authorization decisions without that data being exposed or loaded into Permit or into the management component of your infrastructure if you're using OPAL separately. And in the end of the day, when we're talking about authorization, about access control, one of the biggest challenges is the recursive aspect of it, authorization for authorization. Because if that chain, that recursive chain, has a weak link, the entire thing just falls into shambles. So by creating that separation, creating that need-to-know basis and those silos, you can actually build authorization that A, scales, and B, can remain secure as you move forward.
Thank you for that. We've got just under a minute left, but there's an active thread going on in the comments that I want to bring up as we're all open source guys, right? So there's an active thread in the comments about whether the many eyeballs argument has been debunked or not, meaning with many eyeballs on it, all bugs are shallow. And I would love for each of you, maybe we'll start with Or and then go to AuthN, to provide your view, and I'm going to sneak my view in as well. But Or, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely not something that has been mathematically proven this way or another. But I think when you talk about security, it's not about having discrete points in time. It's about having processes. Nothing is secure. Like if you were assuming that a system is secure, it's a matter of time until it's proven unsecure. The matter is, at the end of the day, it's the race, the arms race between the attackers and defenders, or the people maintaining the software. And the more you have the ability to run quickly and adjust, the better chances you have to keeping the pace within that race. So at least philosophy-wise, if not mathematically, I think the more eyes, definitely the better.
AuthN, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in the counter argument that it has been so the counter argument to it being open source or the many eyeballs is no one's actually reading the code, right? No one's actually auditing the code, which I think there's an element of truth in, right? Like, yeah, I guess like most of the users are not actually going through the code, right? I think that part's true, but then if you're comparing it to the flip, right, which is no one is looking at the code, right? Like the code is like completely siloed or completely invisible, hosted on a SaaS service, which only the people at the company have access to. They can do, so I think some like transparency, whether it's used or not, is still better than no transparency. So I think there's like the ability for it to be audited at any point in time and have complete versioning, you can access the versioning history at any point in time. So you can always see Like there's no running away. There's no hiding from what you've done, right? Like you can't just be like, oh, we always had that fixed. No, you didn't. Like we can see that, right? So so I think that part is like, again, like, the eyeballs part is my counter to that.
Totally agree. I'll weigh in and then we'll draw this to a close. As a reminder to everybody, the recording will be available on the permit.io YouTube channel. But to keep the discussion going in Slack, etc. My personal view on this, and to provide a argument to the benefit of those that question whether open source actually provides a more secure platform. A few years ago, the University of Minnesota announced a bunch of things that they called hypocrite commits to the kernel, where they purposefully introduced some, I mean, not completely malicious, but definitely insecure code into the Linux kernel. And it was initially accepted by the community. So there's an interesting baseline of how you should think about introducing code into your project. I'm a strong supporter of both the points that Advait and Or made. While it doesn't solve everything, it sure solves a heck of a lot of problems and gives you transparency into areas where you don't. Conversely, it's very hard as a software engineer to infer where bugs may be in a closed source blob that's essentially an opaque box for you to interact with. So while nothing's perfect, I also think, as we have seen with folks coming out of the Log4j and even going further back to things like Heartbleed, there's been more of a concerted effort by some of the bigger companies to curate and fund people that are working on maintaining this software versus it just being some poor fellow in their basement working on large open source projects. There's that old XKCD where they have, all these blocks lined up on this little open source project maintained by somebody in their basement. So with that, I want to take the time to thank Or and Advait for joining us, and for Permit and SuperTokens for sponsoring this webinar. Once again, you can find the recordings on the Permit.io YouTube channel, and let's keep the discussion going in Slack. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Omkar. Thank you so much for having this.
Thank you, Omkar. It was great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Avid.
Thank you. Or
Bye.
Thank you.